Henry Kissinger had already warned that if you keep on expanding NATO, then at some point in time you're going to get Russia very upset. Out of these 10 states in Southeast Asia, 9 have an Indic base, and only 1 has a Sinic base, and that is Vietnam. The United States has invested more in Southeast Asia than it has in China, Japan, South Korea, India combined.
Opinion in China is that India is trying to destabilize, that equation. And India, from China's perspective, is falling pretty much in the Western fold. How do you assess India's multi-alignment? On the one hand, we are members of the Quad. On the other hand, we are still in BRICS. We are still in with the SCO. We have our strategic partnership with Russia. We also have, I think, a deepening and a pretty unprecedented deepening at that of our strategic partnerships and so many other convergence with the West.
Trump is a very good friend of India, as you know.
Yeah.
He's not an enemy of India,
Yeah.
but he's going to do a lot of damage to India.
समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया.
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
आप समझा.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
So for the latest episode of The Worldview with Swasti, I thought it will be a good idea to discuss the Asian century and what it means to be living in the Asian century. And I say this knowing very well that there are grinding wars of attrition in different theatres all at once. And to discuss what it means to be living the Asian century, I have with me one of the most well-known and foremost scholars from the region, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Professor Kishore Mahbubani needs no introduction, frankly. He is one of senior Singaporean diplomats. He's also been the president of the United Nations Security Council for a few years. And right now, he is a professor at the National University of Singapore. He's written a whole host of books. Some of the books are really well known. He's written Can Asians Think? He's written another one called Beyond the Age of Innocence. I think his another very well-known book that I have myself read is called Has China Won?, which is extremely thought-provoking narrative on why China is such a formidable geoeconomic actor. Finally, one of his latest works is called The Asian Century. And today he's joining me here in New Delhi for the Print Worldview with Swasti. And we are going to be taking a deep dive into all of this, the position of India, and also the Trumpian disorder and what all it means for us and the future. Very pleased to be joined by Professor Mahbubani in person. Thank you for taking time out for us and the Print.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So let's just start with the very basics, right? And please tell us, what do you think about the current state of how India is engaging with Southeast Asia and also with Singapore? And I ask you this question because I was going through a few surveys done in Singapore that said that what is the reason that India remains disengaged with Southeast Asia as a whole? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the most important fact about India and Southeast Asia that every Indian should know is that there are 10 states in Southeast Asia, members of ASEAN, and out of these 10 states in Southeast Asia, 9 have an Indic base, and only 1 has a Sinic base, and that is Vietnam. So clearly, this shows that India has been having a deep influence in Southeast Asia for 2,000 years or so. And so the big question is, in the 21st century, will be the Asian century, will India be able to recover the long and deep influence it has had in Southeast Asia? And over the long run, I am optimistic that will happen, but that will also require some degree of effort on the part of India, because when I was comparing how 9 countries in Southeast Asia have an Indic base, 1 has a Sinic base, the fact of the matter also now is that Southeast Asia does far more trade with China than it does with India. So I hope at some point in time, India will step up its efforts to integrate more closely with the ASEAN economies.
And if we can fine tune that with Singapore particularly, what would be your assessment there?
Well, Singapore actually was probably one of the first few countries in ASEAN to emphasize that Southeast Asia should do more with India. And I can tell you in the mid 1990s, I just recently came out with my memoirs, Living the Asian Century. And in the memoirs, I've spoken about how Singapore was the one that, in many ways, managed to get India admitted into the ASEAN Regional Forum without, at the same time, getting sort of Pakistan in at the same time. And all that was due to the efforts of the Singapore Prime Minister, who wanted to create an India fever in Singapore, Mr. Goh Chok Tong. So I think Singapore has been at the forefront of efforts to integrate India more closely with Southeast Asia.
Right. And talking about that, I think you would agree that we are certainly living in a very transformative kind of a global moment right now, with so many wars, one and a war of grinding attrition in East Europe, and then there's also a security crisis, pretty much unsolvable, it seems for now, in the Middle East. And then there's also tensions in the South China Sea and in Taiwan. But that brings me to this question on China, and that you've been working a lot on that. Is that how do you see the space for countries? I mean, this realignment that is happening, which is likely to happen, especially now with Donald Trump, with the US, Russia, China, India, and after your thoughts, that I will probably ask you more specifics. But in the grand realignment, where do you see this playing out?
Well, I think there's no question that the US China contest will accelerate over the next 10, 20 years. And as you know, I wrote a book called Has China Won? Explaining the structural forces driving the US China contest. And this will carry on for almost like a mechanical reason, because as China grows and becomes closer to the United States, the United States will try to push China down. This is inevitable. Doesn't matter whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden is president, that happens almost mechanically. So all of us in the region, especially in Southeast Asia, have to manage this. And what the ASEAN countries have done is that they made it a policy to declare very early on that we would not take sides in this contest between US and China. They'd be good friends with the United States, they'd be good friends with China. And so far, the ASEAN countries have balanced it quite well, because on the trading side, we do far more trade with China than we do with the United States. In fact, our trade with China in 2022 was almost $1 trillion, double the size of our trade with United States. But at the same time, United States has invested more in Southeast Asia than it has in China, Japan, South Korea, India combined. So you can see, therefore, that it's quite that Southeast Asia has been able to balance its relations between these two great powers quite well.
But how does that play out? Because you also have then this equation where Philippines, for example, and also now Indonesia, but certainly Philippines and Vietnam, where Philippines has already bought the BrahMos missiles that we jointly co-produce with Russia. And if you go by what people in China say, that the opinion in China is that India is trying to destabilize, that equation. And India, from China's perspective, is falling pretty much in the Western fold. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I just want to sort of pick your brains on trying to understand the Chinese mind better here.
Well, I think for a start, there are always problems. Every region has got problems, and Southeast Asia has a lot of challenges. And you mentioned South China Sea.
Yeah.
Now, South China Sea is not a conflict between China and the 10 ASEAN states. There is territorial disputes between China and 4 ASEAN
Yeah.
countries: Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei. And I think what's interesting is that while the Western media plays up a great deal about all this contestation between China and the Southeast Asian states, most Southeast Asian states are quietly negotiating, quietly working out something with China. It'll take some time for it to be resolved. Now, there's no question that relations between China and the Philippines are very challenged now, and they are going. These two countries are going through a rough patch. But if you ask me whether there'll be a war between China and the Philippines, I can say quite confidently that there won't be a war. There'll be, jostling here and there, because I think China is very careful to avoid wars, and the ASEAN countries are also being very careful about avoiding war. So there will always be problems. There will always be challenges. The question is whether you can manage these challenges. And so far, ASEAN has done a brilliant job of managing this challenge, because despite these challenges, our relations continue to grow stronger.
No, fair point there. And how does this equation look if I were to sort of bring in the element of Russia here and the war in Ukraine? And because that has given a completely different dimension to how Russia is getting pushed with China, regardless of the outcome in the war per se. From India's perspective, what we are trying to understand better is this Russia-China alignment, deepening of this alignment, frankly, regardless of the war, I mean, the outcome, right? Whether the 20% of Ukrainian land is with Russia or not, whether it's neutrality or not. But in the process, from India's perspective, we get worried about how it's Russia's getting pushed with China. Some people would like to say that Russia's become a junior partner. Others have given different descriptions for it. Some call it a dragon bear equation, etc. But what's your assessment? Because from India's perspective, we would not like our best friend to actually get so close to our arch rival.
In my book, Has China Won? One of the most surprising things I say is that there is no natural alliance between Russia and China. In fact, in the long run, if you try to examine what is Russia's biggest security concern, is not Europe. Russia is not worried that German tanks are going to come back, or French troops under Napoleon are going to come back and attack Russia. Russia's biggest long-term challenge is the fact that its longest border is with China, right? And it's got to manage that long border. And remember, in the 1960s and 70s, when the Soviet Union was very powerful and China wasn't, they had a very difficult relationship. Now it's the opposite. China is very powerful and Russia is not. So I think right now, while there is, a partnership between, while there's a partnership between Russia and China, it is a partnership of convenience. And it is, and if you want to ask what caused this partnership of convenience, I would say this was the result of geopolitical incompetence on the part of the Europeans, because when the Cold War ended, many leading American strategic thinkers, including George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, had already warned that if you keep on expanding NATO, then at some point in time you're going to get Russia very upset. And many people had warned and said that if you try and get a former territory of the Soviet Union, Ukraine,
into NATO, yes.
NATO, then you're basically poking Russia in the eye. And I don't understand why the Europeans did that. So once the situation stabilizes on Ukraine, and if there's some kind of peace settlement on Ukraine, then I think Russia will quite naturally drift and become a more autonomous actor. This is a temporary partnership of convenience and doesn't reflect a long-term alliance.
And speaking about the war in Ukraine, of course, I mean, now I think it's getting more and more clear about the fact that I think one has to take into account that Russia had legitimate security concerns, and you cannot really overlook that under the garb of arguing for a country's sovereignty and all of that, because that's how the world functions, and that's perhaps been one of the standing opinions held by professors John Mearsheimer, who's been talking about that for long. But what about the question of agency? I mean, how would you look at that? Because for now, it looks as if the Americans and the Russians are speaking in a way that does not accord any agency to Europeans or to Ukraine. How do you think this is going to really lead to a lasting solution? A temporary ceasefire which can be broken down later, I don't think anybody really wants that, even though I think Donald Trump seems extremely, I would say, hell bent on getting out of the war somehow and announcing a ceasefire. But if you don't accord the agency, how do you really look at a lasting solution? What are your views on that?
Well, I think if the Europeans want to have agency in geopolitics, then they should go and study the ABC of geopolitics. And in the ABC of geopolitics,
Okay.
it says, rule number one, never put all your geopolitical eggs in one basket. I mean, it's common sense. Common sense. You must always hedge. You must always have, you cannot have a situation where you have only option A and no option B and option C. So the Europeans gave their security up completely to one partner, United States of America, assuming that the United States of America would have no other desire but to defend Europe forever. And here comes Donald Trump making a reasonable statement and saying, listen, my job is to take care of the American people.
Yeah.
Why am I spending money defending Europe? And at the end of the day, I heard that I'm told that the Polish foreign minister has said that why are 500 million Europeans asking 300 million Americans to defend themselves against 130 million Russians? Right? It doesn't make sense. And so the Europeans have shown dramatic geopolitical incompetence. And the war in Ukraine, as Professors John Mearsheimer, as Professors Jeff Sachs have documented, was eminently avoidable if you can just take care of the strategic concerns of your neighbor Russia that you have to live with. So I think the Europeans have a lot to answer for their own geopolitical incompetence, because the lack of agency that they have today, the fact that they're being completely bypassed by United States and Russia as they discuss the fate of Ukraine, is a result of them not having developed the competence of their own. And so, for example, one of the oldest rules of diplomacy is that you must always continue talking to your enemy. And European leaders have stopped talking to Russian leaders. This is bizarre. In some ways, Donald Trump is being a wiser person in saying, if I have a problem with the president of Russia, I should talk to him, which is what he's doing. And why did the Europeans stop talking to and you look at the difference in Asia. We have lots of challenges in Asia. We have problems between, let's say, China and Japan as neighbors, and some years they couldn't talk to each other. So what ASEAN did was to create opportunities for the leaders of China and Japan to talk to each other. So at the end of the day, I think if the Europeans want to understand why they are in a geopolitical fix today, they should be very honest and admit the geopolitical mistakes that they made that have led to their situation today. I think it can still be restored, but they have got to recalibrate their policies.
Right. And it was interesting you mentioned hedging. I mean, all international actors should be constantly hedging. And India has been hedging its bets, I would say, quite wisely in the last 3 years. Our multi-alignment has been pretty much intact, even though sometimes I have argued that it's not been in equal distribution, but it's been multi-alignment nonetheless. in this particular very tense geopolitical moment that we are in, how do you assess India's multi-alignment? On the one hand, we are members of the Quad. On the other hand, we are still in BRICS. We are still in with the SCO. We have our strategic partnership with Russia. We also have, I think, a deepening and a pretty unprecedented deepening at that of our strategic partnerships and so many other convergence with the West. How would you assess this? A lot of people would be critical of it. But from in your view, in your country's view, how would you assess that?
Well, I think India is facing a moment of great opportunity, and I like to use the term India is in a geopolitical sweet spot. Because the world is changing, and the way I describe the new world that's coming is a 3M world. It's multi-civilizational. You have many successful civilizations, including Indian civilization. You have a multipolar world and a multilateral world, because a lot of our problems can only be solved multilaterally. Now, in this new 3M world, the second M is multipolar. And one of the strongest, most independent poles in our multipolar world is India, because India is already the 5th largest economy in the world. By 2030, it will be the third largest economy in the world. By 2050, there'll be 3 major economies: US,
United
China,
States, China, and
India.
Yeah.
So these are going to be the 3 new great powers. So this change gives India tremendous opportunity. And the wisest thing that India could do is to be friends with everyone and enemies with none. And that would give India the widest range of options. Of course, you can have differences with countries over some issues, like you had a difference with the Biden administration over the fact that they said that India was involved in some operations in its territory and so on and so forth. But you can always manage these differences.
So you're right. In saying that, of course, India is in a geopolitical sweet spot, but then there are also challenges. I mean, we are not able to make use of the China plus one diversification the way we had intended, because most of the investments that were not going to China didn't really land in India. They went to Vietnam, they went to Singapore. Okay, we are struggling with a lot of domestic reforms, and the Prime Minister tried a few, but then they had to roll back because again it was hugely unpopular. So, how do you what is your assessment of India at this wonderful intersectional moment? That's what I call it. And how do we best manage the challenges and the opportunities and being a democracy and all of that?
Well, I think I would say overall, while India has challenges, the opportunities far exceed the challenges. Because if you look around the world, countries are looking for a new independent pole that they can deal with, especially as they are trying to hedge their bets with US and China. And the stronger India becomes, the more powerful it becomes, the more appealing it becomes to many other countries. And you're right, maybe you haven't succeeded in getting the as much investments as India could have done under the China plus one strategy, but that's not for geopolitical reasons. That's due to economic reasons. And I think the question that India should ask itself is this: the ASEAN economies. ASEAN's population is about half that of India's, but the economies are about the same size. And at the same time, ASEAN has got far more foreign investment than India has had. And what's the big difference? And the big difference is that the ASEAN countries have decided to open up their economies and join free trade agreements in the region. And certainly, we in Southeast Asia were very keen to get India to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the world's largest
RCEP.
free trade agreement, RCEP. And I actually believe that if India had joined RCEP, then it could have definitely got more China plus one investment, because a lot of this plus one investment in turn, by the way, you'll be surprised if you take a component, it crosses borders many times, And each time it crosses the border, if it has to deal with a trade barrier, it creates friction. So all these RCEP and everything have created less and less trade barriers in East Asia. And if India can join RCEP and lower its tariffs, then India can also participate in it. And I want to emphasize one thing, that all the econometric studies done by economists, professional economists, have shown that while there'll be some creative destruction, some Indian industries will lose out in RCEP. Overall, the Indian economy will become much bigger, much stronger, and much more powerful. So I think this is the big economic decision that India has to take, and it's nothing to do with geopolitics.
So, talking about economics, and since we are living in the era of Trumpian economics, some
Yeah.
people call it Trumponomics, and which is the trade wars are back, there are higher tariffs. India is having its own little bit of struggle out there. I mean, politically, geopolitically, I think we really like the Trump administration. Trump has a very high, I would say, popularity ratings in India. Generally, Trump is very popular. A lot of his members of his cabinet are also very popular. But then we are facing a situation where we've had to lower our tariffs. You know, Trump has also talked about the same kind of things for China, for Canada, for Mexico, for the European Union. So this world where we were just discussing economics, how does this pan out under Trump?
Well, I think, as you know, Trump is causing a lot of disruptions, no question. I think his ideas of tariffs are nonsense. I mean, economic nonsense. Tariffs don't lead to economic prosperity at all. In fact, any economist will tell you that if Trump imposes a tariff on an import, it's the American consumer
Exactly.
that will pay for this. And in that sense, I think his ideas are wrong. But whether you like it or not, United States is so powerful, you can't fight the United States. So you have to work with the United States and compromise with the United States. And Trump will compromise. But I think of all the countries that are affected by Trump's tariff wars, in some ways, he may do a lot of damage to India. Because, you know, India, under the rules of WTO, is entitled to, you know, some concessions as a developing state.
Yeah.
And developing states are allowed to maintain high tariffs. Now Trump is taking away
He's taken it away, the
it's funny,
GSP.
Trump
yeah,
is a very good friend of India, as you know.
Yeah.
He's not an enemy of India.
Yeah.
But he's going to do a lot of damage to India. But then this also provides an, you know, I always believe that every crisis provides a danger and an opportunity.
Yeah.
And so it's time for India to also reconsider its views on tariffs. So, for example, if it joins the RCEP, it will have to lower its tariffs. And, you know, the most important question that India has got to ask itself is a very simple question. Can Indians compete globally? And frankly, if you look at all the ethnic groups in the world and ask yourself, which ethnic group has been able to succeed economically in all corners of the world? It's the Indians. And I say this with some confidence because I'm Sindhi. And you know, most Sindhis are, I'm a failed Sindhi because I went into government, I didn't go into business, I didn't make a lot of money. But a lot of my relatives all over the world have done very well in all corners of the world. And you look at the, you know, the Gujaratis, the Parsis, the Marathis and Sindhis,
Marwaris,
and
yes.
Marwaris, and you see how successful they are all over the world. So it is the world that should be frightened of India opening up its economy rather than India being frightened of opening up its economy to the world. Because there will be some creative destruction in the process of opening up. But I think India should have enough psychological confidence to go ahead and say, no, we are able to compete with the rest of the world. I think this is the moment for India to consider making a big leap and doing that.
So there's a question. There's a reason why I'm asking this question, Professor Mahbubani, because frankly, what has happened is that there's a pattern. If you notice that the more, and this is in context to the Western de-risking from China. Now, since the West is de-risking from China and trying to export more from countries like import more from countries like India, so we see a pattern where the more we export to the West, the more we'll end up importing from China, because our dependence on China for the raw materials, etc., continues. And that also makes China a very formidable, so to say, player, at least an economic player, at least in our geoeconomic calculus. And that brings me to this question, which is that what do you think of this tactical rapprochement that you see between India and China right now at the line of actual control? We have tried to talk to each other. We have tried to do some bit of disengagement, even if not de-escalation. How do you assess that? What is your view?
Prime Minister Modi just a few days ago talked about how the Asian century is coming and how China and India can compete with each other, but they can compete with each other without necessarily having to have a conflict, you know. So I share the optimism of Prime Minister Modi that China and India can get along. Now, it's true that they do have border challenges, but it will take some time to resolve. But at the end of the day, I think these issues can be resolved, because what's more important for both China and India are their larger national interests, right? It's in China's goal is to try and overtake United States and become the number one economy in the world. India's goal, as Prime Minister Modi says, is to become a developed economy by 2047, the 100th anniversary of India's independence.
Independence, yes.
So, I mean, these are laudable goals, right? So why, if that's your primary goal, then you set aside your differences and you can freeze your differences and focus on what's really important. You take it two countries. India has a difficult relationship with China, but a country that has had a much more difficult relationship with China is Vietnam. Vietnam has been having difficulties with China for 2,000 years. Vietnam was occupied by China 1,000 years. And you know what? You know who's the number one trading partner of Vietnam today?
China.
China. So if you can overcome. It doesn't mean you solve the problems, but you can set them aside, freeze them, and focus on developing what are your core interests. And for India to succeed in becoming a manufacturing economy, in one way or another, it'll have to do more with China, because China's share of global manufacturing is 45%. And I would say at the end of the day, you must never focus on your bilateral trade deficit with any one country. You must look at your overall economic picture, because you can have trade deficits with the world, but if your economy is growing and becoming stronger, then why should bilateral trade deficits matter? You got to look at the overall big picture. Let me give you a simple example so
Yeah, please.
your ordinary listener can understand. Donald Trump complains about Chinese goods coming to America. But when the Chinese produce a shirt like this, right? Let's say they sell it to United States for $5. The American consumer, when he buys it from the shop, pays $45. So for a $45 shirt, $5 of the value goes to China, $40 of the value goes to the American consumer economy. Who's benefiting more, China or America?
America.
So from a $5 shirt, China gets $5, America gets $40. So who's benefiting more? So don't just look at the bilateral trade deficit. Look at the overall picture and where you are heading.
But then, how does that solve the problem of resilience of supply chains? Because what has frankly happened after COVID and after these different wars is that, if you've also heard our external affairs minister speak about it again and again, is that it's the most efficient model may not be the most resilient model.
Well, I think it's very good to emphasize resilience, and the way you get resilience is through diversification. Remember, I began by saying that the Europeans made a mistake by putting all their geopolitical eggs in one basket. Never put all your economic eggs in one basket. And you must diversify, and you can diversify and look for alternative sources in many of the areas. And that's what I would recommend that all countries do, not just India. And if even if you look at a country like China, it imports a lot of raw materials. It makes sure it doesn't get all its iron ore from Australia only, because then it will be subject to blackmail, right? So they have to diversify, and but diversification means you're going to pay more sometimes, but you do that because that's the way to stay safe.
So basically, you're saying is that resilience will come when there's enough diversification. So I kind of agree with that. Yes, of course. Professor Mahbubani, what is your understanding? Because often when we are speaking about the strategic discourse in India, we are focusing a lot on threats. Yes, of course, because threats are important to be discussed. But are we also discussing the opportunities? So do you see that there is a bit of a disjunct here, that there's too much discussion on threats, but not so much on the opportunities?
Well, I think certainly the one country that has the maximum number of opportunities in the world today is India. Because you look around and look at all the major economic powers. I mean, whether it's United States or Europe, and leaving aside China, you look at Japan, look at South Korea, look at ASEAN, and ask yourself which country has the best relations with the most diverse range of economic partners, and it's India. So there are lots of opportunities for India, but to achieve that, you need to develop a more outward looking orientation and grab the opportunities in the rest of the world. Because there's a danger that because you have a huge internal consumer market, you would think, oh, I'm going to protect this market, and by protecting this market, I'll grow. Actually, you have a huge market, but in global terms, it's a small market relative to the global economy. I mean, India's economy is 3 to 4 trillion.
Yeah, yeah. It's
The
about
global economy
close to
is
4 trillion.
100 trillion, right? Why don't you focus on the $100 trillion global economy and not so much your $3 to 4 trillion domestic economy?
So that's the key takeaway from the discussion, which is that India should be discussing on the opportunities a lot more than we are perhaps discussing the threats. It's not a zero sum game, I understand. We have to look at both, but perhaps also be more optimistic in what looks like not so optimistic the world order right now. But on that note, Professor Mahbubani, what an honor it was to have you in person and to have you on the Worldview with Swasti. And once again, thank you so much for taking time out
Okay.
for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad we could do it.